Basically, it
Good
was
luck.
not a coup. It was a revolution that millions of people participated in. The reason we participated, me included, I was 19 back in the day, it was because we had severe problems with corruption and a tyrannical puppet of Russia, Yanukovych, who refused to make a treaty with the European Union, which is what most of the people in Ukraine wanted, 60-something%, and especially younger people wanted to move away from Russian control, from Russians owning every single business industry in my country, and to have some sort of like laws and order, and also have some sort of democracy and liberty that is what something people have in the West, and that's something that we did not have. So that was about, a revolution was about that, about students going and protesting and getting beaten up, and Yanukovych then going to Russia to essentially ask Putin, his buddy, how can he stop the protesters, which he then made dictator laws that prohibited people to effectively protest at all in this country. So we didn't appreciate that, and we went, literally millions of people participated in Maidan. That is not a coup. That is not something you buy for Obama or Nuland cookies. I'm sorry to say, never received a single cookie yet. It's been a long time. And yeah, all of that, when going to Georgia is a whole other thing, but that's just what Russia does. It creates unrest. It supports militias in the countries, and then it basically floods them with weapons, and it also applies its own soldiers to annex territory by the guise of protecting Russian speakers or any of that. Scott is a master, I believe Scott is the name, right? Here, but I am a Russian speaker from Eastern Ukraine. It's about as east as it gets in Kharkiv, and I didn't require their protection. I was never prosecuted. What they did is that they attacked us under the guise of protecting Russian speakers that was never prosecuted in this country, because half of us literally are Russian speakers. We have been Russified back in the day by Russian Empire. So yeah, this war is about, not about you. I'm sad to say some things are not about America. This war is about our very long time, centuries long oppressor trying to thrust us back under their control. And we didn't want that. People in Georgia don't want that, if you can see it by now, currently, by the revolution and the protests going on in the country, exactly for the same reason, because their corrupt Russian puppet government refused the people's will to be part of Europe. So it was never about NATO, because we never discussed joining NATO until Russian invasion. It was never even a conversation in Ukraine about joining NATO. Yeah, they do have borders with NATO right now, and they had them before. Now it's even bigger. It doubled because Finland, in fear of Russia, joined NATO. That's why people join NATO, because they want protection from Russian aggression.
You know, every once in a while, you got to hear from the people who are actually there in person for these events. She was one of the people who was there in person for the Maidan Revolution. Not the, in fact, let me just go ahead and flip this around over here to here. The second guy from the left, I believe his name is Scott Horton. He is very much. I'm going to try and be careful with this, because by and large, he generally is pro-Russian, but more in effect, I think, than necessarily deliberate. I think, because I'm not too familiar with him. I do know that some of the big people who are on Russia's side quote him quite often. And the overall thesis of the website he runs is that U.S. foreign policy has been absolutely horrendous for ever since World War II. In fact, I think he, if I remember correctly, even has some problems with how World War II ended. So this is she was directly addressing his claims in the previous segment, which I don't have, but hearing her describe what happened and also make the requisite in-jokes about cookies from Newland and all this kind of stuff, she can directly express what happened, not through the filter of, me reading other people's messages, not through the filter of pro-Russians or even pro-Ukrainians, though she is one. but directly from her own words. And this is someone who is clearly expressing that this was the Ukrainian people's will. It had nothing to do with the US, nothing to do with NATO. In fact, from everything I've researched, the whole wanting to join NATO thing really didn't even come to a fore until 2022 when Russia invaded. Before then, Ukrainians had a very low interest in being part of NATO at all. So interesting. And I thought that was something good to listen to at the start of today's stream. By the way, I'm Brian Lusk. Thank you for joining me today on today's stream. I do see we have Ozzy, Lucille, and Jerry here already. Glad to have you all here. And I believe you're correct, Ozzy, but I don't know for sure. So I can't speak to it. But thank you for pointing that out. President Zelensky did have a conversation with President Trump about freezing the war and was asked about it. Let's see. I'm going to back this up. You'll need to read what he's saying. In fact, I'll just read it to you and mute the audio here. This is a reporter. According to some reports, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump may want to freeze the conflict. In addition, yesterday he said that Ukraine had allegedly agreed to sign a security agreement. When we talk about freezing the conflict, says President Zelensky, if it is between us, we talked about it. I said that we, more than anyone in the world, want the war to end. And of course, a diplomatic end of the war will save more lives, and we want that. But I emphasized to both President Macron and President Trump that you can see that Putin does not want to end this war. According to some reports, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump may want to freeze the conflict. In addition, yesterday he said that Ukraine had allegedly agreed to sign a security agreement. When we talk about freezing the conflict, okay, never mind, this is repeating itself here. But by and large, you can talk about freezing the conflict, but right now, Russia's economy is entirely based on keeping this conflict going. Why do you think they've been in Syria, Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, etc.? Countries across Africa. Everywhere they've been getting their meddling fingers into. They can't survive without chaos. They can't survive without war, at least according to their current economy. This is the Ukrainian cities of Mariupol, Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Vuhledar, Lyman. This is the aftermath of the Russian world. And you can see there that when Russia comes, this is how they learned to wage war. In fact, they learned this in Chechnya. When the first time they went into Chechnya, they got into a fight with the Chechens. The Chechens really kind of schooled them, kicked them right out. They signed some agreements to end the war. A couple of years go by, they've rebuilt, and they come back and they just flatten cities in Chechnya. And since then, they've done it in Syria. They've done it in Georgia. They've done it in Ukraine. And Ukraine is still fighting against this atrocity here. So let's go ahead and talk about a whole lot of things that have been going on in the war. There is so much, actually, in the world that I'm going to say is directly related to what's going on in the war. So let's talk about Georgia for a moment or two. Now, it's been, I believe, around 12 days of protests in Georgia, and it has been getting intense. A lot of things have been going on. I'm going to try and long story short this because there's a similar story going on both in Georgia and in Romania. Now, I'm not going to address Romania today. I don't have the details on that right now. But Georgia, the elections got meddled with. We actually saw videos of thugs running in and stuffing ballot boxes with fake ballots. Where to the point where you couldn't possibly, sort out the legitimate ballots from the fake ones. There was intimidation, there was violence. There was a lot of things that Russia was doing to try and keep the elections in Georgia from being carried out in a safe and fair manner. So after that election, the people of Georgia started to rise up. And it started smaller and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger. Now they've got police forces out there. They've got water cannons out there. In fact, it's one of the protesters got a firework cannon together. They've started getting into brutal tactics of arrests and various other brutal Russian tactics by the pro-Russian government forces. The people of Georgia are saying they've had enough, and they want their own future, not the one that's tied to Russia. Another wave of energetic civil protests erupting. This was as of yesterday. More on the protests in Georgia. You can see the fireworks are getting pretty intense involved. Look at the numbers of people here. Thousands upon thousands of people. The Georgian authorities have deployed tear gas, and the protesters have been countering this tear gas. They say there's something they're doing to counter it, and I haven't really caught on to exactly what. It's not just picking up the smoke grenades and throwing them back. So there's a lot of things going on there. Some amazing scenes of standing up to the authorities in Georgia. And this is a country that Georgians are going to fight. They're going to fight for their freedom. Over 400 people have been detained during protests in Georgia, with the Interior Ministry reporting over 30 involved in criminal cases, and 372, quote, administratively detained. In other words, these are people that did nothing illegal, but they are being held without charge, and 100 plus fined. This is after 11 days of protests here. And there's the water cannon that the government forces have brought in. This is where we're in cold months here. This is not exactly roasty temperatures here. They've also been putting pepper spray into the water. Now, I did see an interesting story the other day that a fire truck was showing up to refill the water cannon, and when in view of the police, the fire truck stopped and emptied its entire tank of water out onto the ground. So we're seeing a lot of pressures going on right here. Some we've seen resignations of government officials from the Georgian Dream Party, which is pro-Russian. We've seen government officials running away. One of them ran to a Russian military base. The people that are being brought in to beat and torment protesters are often Russian. It's pretty crazy. That's Georgia. Now let's talk about Syria. And, Syria has been in a state of basically a cold civil war for the last decade, since about 2013, 2014, when the U.S. basically washed their hands of the place and stepped out, and Russia forced a ceasefire supporting Assad, the brutal dictator of Syria. Well, in the last week or so, and I'm going to try and high-level overview what happened in Syria here, because there's a lot going on, and I've done some research, but I'm going to try and keep this as accurate as I can, but also high-level. There's three major groups in Syria. There's the government and Syrian Arab Army Forces. There's HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is supported by Turkey and contains former elements of Al-Qaeda, though they have reportedly renounced their Al-Qaeda links and leanings. There's been some positive signs there. I'm not going to get into that in detail, but it's backed by Turkey. They're the ones that have been on huge amounts of offensives. Then there's the Kurds, which are part of, I believe it's SDF is what they go by. And the Kurds are backed by the U.S., and it has been just crazy going on. So at the highest level, all of a sudden, after 10 years, the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, goes on the offensive and starts just sweeping Assad forces out. They're not even trying to defend positions. They're falling back. They're falling apart. They are surrendering, anything but fighting for the Syrian government. So they start sweeping through. The Kurds realize what's going on, and they start working on their own offensives and taking area to prevent HTS from expanding into areas they control. And they start keep moving as well. Now, here's the thing about Syria. At the highest level, that is a direct route between Iran and Hezbollah that they can use for resupply. Also, there's the Shiite militias that tend to come out of Iraq to support the Assad regime and the Russians. So all of that area right there is just a powder keg, is the best way I can describe it. On the left, on one side, you got the Turkish-backed forces that are just sweeping through towns. On the right side, you got the Kurdish forces and the U.S., which is effectively doing anti-terrorism operations, deploying things like A-10s to destroy columns of these Shiite militias and other forces trying to come into the area that the Kurds control. And finally, after all the things going on, Bashar al-Assad finally flees the country. In fact, there was word that he was killed in a plane crash. That turned out to not be true. It was believed to be cover for the Russians evacuating Assad from the country. So the royal family and Assad himself disappeared. Royal family, his family, disappeared out of the country, and leaving, I might add, pockets of Russian forces behind that were now cut off from the bases that they have on the Mediterranean for resupply. Now, the Russians are sitting there just utterly shocked. They didn't even have a chance to respond to this. They had no real plan. The leaders in Syria were acted just like typical Russian leadership. They called for instructions because nobody in the Russian army wants to make a decision on their own, because with making a decision comes the responsibility therefore. And so they called up and said, "Hey, things are falling apart. Should we be shooting at somebody?" And no answer came. And by the time an answer would have come, it was already too late. The Russian fleet has now left the port, whose name escapes me at the moment, but it's not important. It is a Syrian port that the Russians were using as a military base. The HTS forces have captured some Syrian Air Force equipment. Some of that Air Force equipment, the Russian Air Force equipment, was destroyed on the ground, purportedly by Israeli forces. And at this point, the HTS has managed to stand up a new government. The prime minister is supporting that new government, and that's basically where we are. They're uncovering a ton of abuse out of Syria. It's the long story short of it all is there may not be any good sides in this. There may be less bad sides. But from my perspective, for a few brief moments, the people of Syria who have been under the thumb of a brutal dictator have an opportunity for things to be better. Will they be better? I don't know. But there's hope for them for now. So let's quickly go through some of the stuff from Syria here. I'll try and burn through it real quick because we're here about Ukraine. This is just kind of giving an overall feel for what's going on with Russian operations here. So the Russians, this is just a commentary about medical infrastructure being attacked in Syria. Syrian government forces or Russian forces did nearly all the attacks on medical facilities. The rebel groups, if you want to call them that, and everybody else did very few. Which should tell you what kind of brutal dictators we're dealing with. Syrian opposition formed an interim government. I mentioned that, headed by Mohammed Bashir. And Recep Erdogan has said that the Syrian people have carried out an authentic revolution and crowned it with success. And we will not allow the division of Syrian lands. He was behind a lot of what happened, so we'll see. Now, the effects of this, and I've got a ton of things to go through, so let's do this fast. Syria had been absolutely blocking cheap Middle Eastern oil from getting to Europe. Thank you, Tartus. By doing that, they allowed the Iranian oil supplies to get all the way to Syria, and therefore they could basically keep that under control. Now that that Syria has been overthrown, there's a possibility that a new pipeline can be finished, the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, allowing Turkey, who's got a role in this, to really put to have a commanding position in the fuel supply going into Europe. This, if nothing else, cuts Russia out of the deal. Russia had been the one guaranteeing the situation here. Now it's not Russia anymore. They have no deal in the middle of this. Zelensky stated that one of the reasons for the fall of the Assad regime was a lack of sufficient numbers of Russian troops. That's because there's 800,000 of them in Ukraine, and they weren't there in Syria to provide the guarantees that they claimed they would. Strangely enough, by focusing so much on Ukraine, Russia is losing control of everything else about their far-flung empire. The Russians may have struck a deal with the rebel forces, who are now the government of Syria, to allow them to evacuate their bases and not be attacked. That appears to be taking place. I've seen some reports of that. People from Syria are now flooding the border, heading back to Syria out of Turkey. The biggest sign that the Russians do not have any control of the situation is right here. Peskov has stated that it is premature to discuss the issue of maintaining Russian bases in Syria. Thus, in this situation, nothing depends on Russia at all. As Dmitry at War Translated states, billions of dollars and years spent in the region, and in just 11 days, they managed to lose influence. The Syrian embassy in Moscow now has the new flag of the new government already flying in its place. This is probably an indication, honestly, that Russia's trying to save as much face as they can, trying to preserve that base there, because without that base, their entire operations throughout Africa lose it all. They won't be able to resupply any of their like security agreements or support any of the dictators and bad guys that they are. And so this is probably a sign of them trying to appease the new government sufficiently to keep their stuff in place. Okay, already talked about that in the larger area of it. Just kind of, you'll see some of these, like this is a Russian Panzer that was destroyed by rebels. Israel got involved a few days after things started. They struck Russian military targets and Syrian military targets, likely to keep it out of the hands of HTS rather than necessarily Syria itself. They've also moved armor to a mountain overlooking Damascus, about 20 kilometers away, and maybe doing additional operations there in the Golan Heights. The Russians, oh man, there's so much I got to go through here. The Russians have started to come to accept the new situation in there. They've reached a stage of acceptance, according to Dmitry, acknowledging the need to withdraw from Africa and instead call to develop Siberia. Russia has this huge nation. If they would stop spending all their money on waging war and start spending that money on making their country better, they could be doing such amazing things. Easily they could rival the U.S. if they would let themselves be themselves instead of constantly going to these wars. The Rybar at the point of this post here, that's a Russian source, said that the Russian presence in Syria is hanging by a thread. Further information since it has basically eliminated that thread. And he's the one that talks about the reason why the Russians didn't do anything to prevent the fall of Assad. The fact that the leaders there were looking for directions from Moscow. They didn't want to take the risk of taking action themselves. The long story short, though, from some of these propagandists is that since we're not spending $3 million a day in Syria, we can spend that money in Ukraine instead, which is why I am currently hesitant to call this all a victory for Ukraine, at least in the short term. This is where the posts that talk about the Russians leaving Tartus base. There we go. And the last I saw, they had several ships that were kind of hanging around the area, about a few miles out to sea. Likely they moved them out there to prevent them from being captured by whatever forces came along. A ship in port is a lot easier to capture than a ship at sea. There's been basically long convoy trains of airplanes leaving Syria, heading to Russia, taking likely troops and equipment back to the country. Clearly, Russia is pulling out. Now, this is the Russian propagandist talking about those pipelines I mentioned here. There's a lot to this, and basically it all came down to, by supporting Assad, it meant that Russia had a lot of money from doing this here. The market of their share of the gas market being sent through this area was a big money maker for Russia. And just so you're wondering, if Assad was actually just this really nice guy that had the needs of his people at heart, this is his car collection. Seriously, not a lot of them are really expensive cars, but still, that's a lot of cars. In the years leading up to this, though, the Assads have bought 19 apartments in Moscow City for $40 million. So now we know where the money's been going. Back in 2014, though, Assad promised that he would not leave the country under any circumstances. I am not Yanukovych, he declared. And yet, it took less than 7 days for him to bail out of the country because he didn't stand a chance. Compare, by the way, to President Zelensky. I need ammunition, not a ride. The Kremlin did confirm that they have now been granted asylum in Russia. No surprise there. I don't know how long he'll survive, but Yanukovych, I think, is still alive, so he'll probably last a while. What is Ukraine's role in Assad's bloody dictatorship being thrown down? The connection is direct. The opposition's lightning speed march became possible also thanks to the resilience and bravery of Ukrainian defenders. They forced Putin to get stuck in the full-scale war with Ukraine for almost 3 years. The Ukrainians basically sucked all the resources out of Russia's military. They sucked all the lifeblood of their best military corps, their best units, their best equipment. And when push came to shove, they had nothing left to send to Syria to help keep it alive for Assad. President Zelensky, though, said that there will be retaliation for Assad's fall, stating Assad and Putin are not just vassal and suzerain, they are accomplices in violence. Dictators like Assad rely on those like Putin, and Putin will attempt to avenge Assad's fall. And this is where things start getting problematic for Ukraine. A lot of celebrations in Syria, showing once the Assad regime fell. This is the whole logistics chain that gets destroyed by this loss of Syria. They've lost the ability to do a lot of this as a refueling and logistics point in Syria. They will have to find other ways to try and reinforce their operations in Africa. I'm going to play this, but I'm going to mute it because I'm going to talk about what I see in this video. This is from CNN. They're doing an interview. I believe she talks a lot about the happiness they're feeling, the things that are going on. But notice something right here. No hijabs. There's no hijabs behind them either. And this is probably the best indication that the rebels are trying their best to not make this a religious thing. If they want to have a functional country, when all is said and done, they're going to have to allow people to have some level of freedom. Ozzy, I know about the underground gulag. It is horrifying stuff, and I don't have it queued up here. But I can talk about it in a moment. I just don't have anything queued up for it. General amnesty was announced by HTS for all Syrian army conscripts. That makes perfect sense. Trying to go through and grab all of the former Syrian army folks and punish them is going to make it harder to reunite the country. Russians out of Tartus again. Syrian Arab army soldiers who laid down their arms are now reportedly running to Iraq, trying to stay safe from potentially HTS rebels. As Jason J. Smart states, Putin always abandons his allies. He does not escalate. Confront Putin for being the monster that he is and stop worrying about the response. Putin walks away when people no longer serve his interests. And Jason J. Smart did share this cartoon here, which made me laugh, I admit. I probably shouldn't have laughed. Let's see, get this down just a little bit farther. You can see him pulling the plug on the life support for Assad. Russia even petitioned Turkey to help them withdraw their troops from Syria. No word on how much help they're getting from that. It's crazy stuff there. In the end, the Institute for the Study of War analyzes this and is saying basically there's a lot of uncertainty about the long-term situation here. Now, Ozzy specifically mentioned something that needs to be addressed. I believe it's Sindania, I think it is, prison was liberated or captured, depending on which side you want to look at it from, taken from the Assad regime. And this multi-level prison was full of political prisoners, tortures, abuse, murders, and death. As Ozzy stated, children were conceived, born, and grew up in this underground place. One of them could only speak one word, and I think it was the word for Aleppo. Didn't know how to speak anything else. One man entirely lost his memory. A known anti-Assad individual was kept alive in horrific conditions, looking wasted, gaunt, and practically near death. And I say that because they killed him right before the prison was liberated, because they knew that if he was allowed to out, he would tell everyone about the horrors he had witnessed in that prison. This is the Assad regime. No tears should be shed for Assad leaving. And it's hard to imagine it could be any worse with somebody else taking control. That said, only one thing's going to be able to tell us what's going to happen, and that is time. There could be a wonderful country that comes out of Syria, or there could be an even more brutal dictatorship. We're just going to have to watch and see. All these things are connected. Russia is pulling the strings in each and every one. Supporting dictators, overthrowing democratically elected governments, corrupting elections, all of it. Let's talk briefly about Transnistria. You already know what Transnistria is. That's the breakaway region of Moldova that the Russians control. The lights are going out there in the occupied part of Moldova, named Transnistria, and they've declared an economic emergency due to the disruption of Russian gas supplies. Ukraine is unwilling to renew the contract that will pump Russian gas into the country. The reason this is significant is because two reasons. The largest gas power generating facility is in Transnistria for all of Moldova. So up till recently, they were holding Moldova hostage for power. Moldova in the last year or so has transitioned their power facilities, their power lines over to the European power grid. Now Transnistria, with no gas, can't generate its own power. And Moldova is connected straight to Europe, so they can get power from Europe. And now it's an emergency for Transnistria, Russian controlled, and once again, they're left in the cold. All of these things are related. They're all interconnected. They're all part of the Russian world. Ozzy, why did Assad do this? Assad was actually a dentist, as I recall, and was actually very well liked. He was learned in the UK. He wasn't intended to be the leader of the country. But when his older brother died, he was called back to Syria to be the ruler of the country. But he was a dentist. And the moment somebody challenged his rule, instead of acting like a dentist, he did the only thing he knew how to do. And that was to brutally repress it, because he didn't know how to do anything else. He didn't have the background in leadership. He didn't have the learning and how to deal with the politics of his own nation. The unwanted son. And yet he rose to the throne to control the country. And he knew nothing other than what he had learned from his father, which is very little. I'm not going to be sympathetic to the man, but I am going to state that he was out of his depth, and he did the only thing he knew how to do, and that is to brutally repress. Imagine a different world where he'd just been a dentist. So let's talk about Donald Trump for a few minutes here. There have been a lot of disinformation bits that have coming out about Donald Trump. The Russians are not very happy with his election. They celebrated in 2016 when he was elected. Not so much celebration this time. For instance, the Russians have said, or I should say, a British analyst by the name of Alexander Macoris has said that Trump was indifferent to Zelensky during the recent meeting they had with Macron, Zelensky, and Trump in Paris in association with the rededication, I guess, for Notre Dame, which has been reconstructed after the fire. And he analyzed it, saying that Trump wasn't happy about this. He wasn't interested in it. Said that the meeting only lasted 20 minutes, but this doesn't match reality. The reality is that the meeting lasted 35 minutes. 35 minutes. Trump did not agree with this assessment of what happened. He wrote he actually says, Trump said that he wants to make peace. That's something new. He wants a ceasefire. He wants to make peace. We haven't discussed the details. He thinks it's time, and Putin should think it's time because he's lost. When you lose 700,000 people, it's time. It's not going to end until there's peace. which is an interesting difference in the way Trump is addressing the situation. It's the first time he said that Vladimir Putin has lost. So, are we seeing something new? Or is this just the situation of Trump talking about the last person who had his ear? I don't know. So, like I said, the Russians have not been happy about Donald Trump's victory, because unlike in 2016, they say it seems that Donald Trump's priorities are not aligned with the Kremlin in the same way. Or at least it's not believed that they're aligned in the same way. You can take that in a bunch of different ways. But again, I've seen some real indications that there could be positive news for Donald Trump. But what's even funnier is that the Ukrainians have the opportunity to really bring this home. You see, Donald Trump has a favorability a rating after a poll of Ukrainians of 44.6%. Now tell me, Donald Trump, if you have a group of people that are celebrating you, that are excited about you, Donald Trump is the type of man who will do things for you. He wants to be celebrated. He wants to be lauded as a peacemaker, as a leader, as all these things. And the Ukrainians have a 44.6% favorability rating for him, compared to Europe's 16% in France, 30% in the UK, Hungary, 37%. And Hungary is where Viktor Orban is. So you'd think it would be higher there. So Ukraine could literally appeal to Donald Trump's ego, because the Russians put up the nude pictures of Melania Trump. The Russians have been bad-mouthing Donald Trump. The Russians have been pushing him away. So the Ukrainians could appeal to him and say, we believe in you, Donald Trump, that you will save us, that you will bring peace, that you will equip our military so that we can kick the Russians out. It's a possibility. Just one possibility. Eye doctor. You're right, not dentist. It was eye doctor. Going from memory. Sometimes going from memory sucks, because the memory sucks sometimes. President Zelensky appealed to Donald Trump's ego as well. He told Trump that Putin fears only him and perhaps China. This is, I hate to say it this way, but this is how you deal with Donald Trump. If he thinks that Putin fears him, then he will be an attack dog for Zelensky in this regard. That's not Zelensky playing the situation, because I suspect there's some truth here. Now, it could be that he fears him because he can't control exactly what he's going to do. He might keep trying. I don't know. But this is how you work with Donald Trump. Right here. So let's go into the news from Ukraine itself. Finally, after all of these international events, all the things going on, something about, by the way, I mentioned Romania in passing. There's equivalent of the Supreme Court just overturned the election there, because the man who got the most votes, somewhere around 20%, did so without properly declaring incomes and sources of support and things like that. I'm not really clear on exactly everything going on there, so I'm just giving you that high-level look at it. The Russians had clearly wanted this guy in, and had really juiced up, apparently, TikTok to create all this fake support for him. And so that's, again, Russia meddling in elections. All right, so let's go on to Ukraine itself here. A Russian missile struck a private clinic in Zaporizhia. Don't you remember us talking about medical facilities being attacked in Syria? Well, medical facilities purely civilian facilities here. Come on. Now, this is an interesting one, and I don't know how I feel about it. The BBC says that anonymous sources in Ukraine's general staff said that the mobilization rates are not covering their losses. Other sources have said otherwise. And in fact, if you go and watch Greg Terry Experience, he talked about this, I believe, and said that this was not true. That there's no point in mobilizing additional troops if there's not additional equipment to equip them with. But they are replacing without any issues there. Another thing that's come up that never gets talked about is the Ukrainian casualty rates. For the first time, we're seeing an actual reported number directly from Zelensky himself. 43,000 soldiers dead and 370,000 cases of medical assistance for the wounded, casualties, half of whom returned to battle. So he's claiming roughly actual losses from the military, not civilians, military, of around 200 some thousand. Then he's also saying that there was the Russians are losing at a ratio of 5 or even 6 to 1 compared to Ukraine. So overall, this is a fairly rosy picture. And I think if you only count military casualties, this is probably accurate, at least close to accurate. Interesting to see it come from Zelensky himself, though, which is quite the difference. The Ukrainian casualties almost never get talked about, and that's because the numbers we get from Russia are wrong, and the numbers that we get from Ukraine are probably pretty darn close. Hi, Robbie. Glad to see you on board, and welcome aboard. As you can see, Ozzy's already seen you here. Let's go ahead and move into the news out of Russia, and there's some interesting things going on here. Yeah. A Kremlin demographer has suggested launching a national project to save men due to recent excess of male mortality in Russia. I wonder what might be causing an excessive male mortality rate in Russia. Something that may have started about 3 years ago, with its initial aspects happening somewhere around 13 years ago. 10 years ago. I don't know. Something might have happened around that time frame. Seems kind of weird that all of a sudden Russia would have a male mortality problem at this point in time. They could solve that by just getting all their troops out of Ukraine. There was a strike on an ammunition warehouse in Russian-occupied Yenikiev, Donetsk Oblast, with detonations and the whole 9 yards. They had to evacuate some nearby houses and streets. This one caught my eye. Let me just go ahead and play the video and mute it. I don't think you'll hear it anyway. This is icicles that formed after the bursting of a pipe, a sewage pipe that happened in Volgograd. Maybe we're just seeing things that are seeing a few things here. Just saying. Okay, I have to apologize here. Some of these posts I have had sitting queued up for a few hours now. Russian propagandists declare that their national trait is that they have been fooled for centuries, from Alexander I to the Minsk and Istanbul peace talks. This victim mindset is absolutely amazing to me. We see some of that happening in certain aspects of the politics here in the U.S., but I don't think I've ever seen an entire nation claim that they have been fooled by everybody and everything, and yet still claim to be strong and powerful. Maybe they need to rethink things about how they run their country. Russia's chief spy has stated that the Russian economy, despite the sanctions and the theft of our sovereign assets, the Russian economy is demonstrating growth, with import substitution developing at an accelerated pace, including in high-tech industries. That the strategic initiative in all areas belongs to us, and we are close to achieving our set goals, whereas the armed forces of Ukraine are on the brink of collapse, and Zelensky regime has completely lost legitimacy and consequently the ability to negotiate. I hope I gave enough of the powerful way that the Russians like to talk. But yeah, this is their perspective from their chief spy, who is not their chief economist. The governor of Russia's Saratov region reported an attempt by drones to attack a military airfield, saying it was thwarted. This might have been Ingles 2. They've just brought some more planes into Ingles 2 again. So we're watching what's going on in that area. Ramzan Kadyrov, kind of like the chief spy talking about the economy, Ramzan Kadyrov, who knows nothing about the military, says that the Ukrainian military only has until the end of the year to fight, after which the Russians will basically wipe them out. If they could wipe them out that fast, why haven't they done it so far? The Russians have handed over the bodies of the Ukrainian soldiers they claim were killed in the IL-76 crash. They've now had enough time to generate the dead bodies for Ukraine, so I expect they will turn out to be Ukrainian servicemen when they finish with their DNA checks here. But I wonder how many of them, if any, were actually on board this plane, because the video we saw from the actual crash site showed no bodies. Due to the ban on personal vehicles, the Russians report that their militants are now forced to hire taxi drivers willing to pick up the wounded from the evacuation point and transport them to the hospital. Now that's going to be an interesting drive for your taxi. Yeah, let's just turn on the meter here. The situation, the economic situation in Russia is so good, this village is begging for a road because the one that they've got now is basically non-existent. That's the one that actually lets people come to their village. I'm just going to skip on by that one here. Russia claimed to be able to produce roughly 300 Oreshnik ballistic missiles annually at a rate of 25 per month. This is absurd. Now, here's what I do have to say. The Oreshnik is based on an older ballistic missile design. So they might convert 25 older ballistic missiles to this Oreshnik standard potentially. But they're not new producing 25 of these missiles a month. They can't even produce that many Iskander or Kinzhal missiles a month. They're not going to do it with a ballistic missile. Not at this rate, not with their economy like it is. I share it because it makes me laugh, honestly. They are so confident in Oreshnik, though, that they say it effectively eliminates the needs to use nuclear weapons. Considering China, it is said, has told them not to use nuclear weapons, they have to have some reason not to use them. Russia's economy faces recession, according to economists surveyed by The Insider, which is a Russian language publication. I'm not going to go into all the details here. Basically, the economy is overheating. There's a potential for stagflation, etc., etc., etc. Go ahead and just read that when you get a few minutes. If you are one of the economic people that wants to get into that type of stuff. I am not a professional of economics, so I'm going to let you guys read that and make your own conclusions. In Russia, though, they've now put out the ability for law enforcement to freeze bank accounts without a court order, presumably to fight crime. The central bank is vocally against the move, which will make extortion of regular people by the FSB and police even easier. Also in Russia, let's take a look at some of their corruption. An army medic and his superiors have stolen over 12 million rubles by performing surgeries on his soldiers. But they did it to implant shrapnel in the soldiers so they could get medical leave from combat duties and get big wounded in action payouts. That's an interesting way to get your corruption on. I already talked about that earlier. Leaflets were posted all around Donetsk, which said that people should stop cooperating with the Russians. The leaflets read, "Betrayal guarantees death." The special operations from Ukraine say it's the work of the resistance movement, not their work. Over on the Kerch Bridge, I'm trying to figure this one out here. So maybe one of you guys can tell me. Almost half of the barges that were previously placed to protect the Kerch Bridge have disappeared. Now, there have been some military actions in the Kerch Strait. There have been a few things going on, but that I don't think would explain half of the barges being pulled or disappearing with no sign of them off of this defensive line. So why would Russia pull those barges off of the Kerch Bridge? Let me know your theories in the comments. I'll be watching for it. And yes, I saw your Uber on the front comment there, Ozzy. I laughed. The Russians seem to be getting ready for something out of Crimea because they're seeing a lot more Russian military equipment along Crimean highways. They report on things like launch containers for the S-300 and S-400 heading in the direction of Simferopol. Pontoon bridge parts heading to the north of the peninsula. Landing, I think they have some river landing ships as well. This could indicate something happening in the Kherson region near Dnipro, which I do have some details on in a little bit here. But the Russians could be getting active in the Zaporizhia direction again in hopes of pulling off a surprise. But we'll talk about that in a bit. On the other hand, the water supply in Crimea is getting critically low as a result of a drought. The reservoir has run dry, the dams remain dry, and could collapse. A lot of things are going wrong for Crimea right now. They've always been pretty dry there, and it was with water being fed from Ukraine that they were able to keep up the what they were doing there in the past. Let's bump into the international market for a little bit here. Lukashenko declared that he has brought nuclear warheads to Belarus, more than a dozen units. And then he says that he is planning to deploy Oreshnik missile systems in the country and potentially has 30 of the locations that they could deploy them. They're already drawing maps showing the range and flight times to various places that they would want to hit. Already talked about Transnistria earlier. Let's see, keep on going. Ozzy states that Russia has frozen the ruble exchange market. A fellow Ukraine supporter with family in Russia told me that the black market Russian USD rate is now 275. Woo! Rostov region. Yeah, I believe it. I'd believe it. Already talked about Moldova and Transnistria. Apparently, Macron proposed to send foreign troops to Ukraine, at least until they become part of NATO. Interesting. I've only seen it from one or two sources, though, so I'm not going to consider it confirmed. If so, it's about time. You see, if the Europeans truly are concerned about Ukraine, and about Russia coming through Ukraine to attack Europe, then why aren't there already European troops there? They need to get on the ball. They need to get the supply line set up. They need to get their manufacturing up to speed, and they need to be there actually fighting for Europe. And if they aren't already, why aren't they? This could be the first signs that it's happening, but we'll see. The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has suggested that Ukrainian peace talks could start this winter. We'll see how that goes. There's also been talk of Poland providing a force to help out in Ukraine as well, but we'll see about that. Then the U.S. said decisions about Ukraine's military draft are Ukraine's to make, but if they expand their forces, the U.S. and allies stand ready to equip and train them for battle. If you're ready to equip and train more forces for battle, why aren't you equipping the existing forces for battle? Or as Zelensky stated, we must not compensate the lack of equipment and training with the youth of soldiers. The priority should be providing missiles and lowering Russia's military potential, not Ukraine's draft age. The goal should be to preserve as many lives as possible, not to preserve weapons in storage. The EU is pushing for an additional $100 billion in defense funding in the EU's next 7-year budget, up from just $10 billion today. This will be the first real sign of the European Union taking their defense seriously. Denmark stepping up with an additional $348 million in funding and expedited delivery of Caesar artillery systems. UK has launched new sanctions on illicit gold trade players there. Hi, Phil. Glad to have you on board. And this is supposed to, by the way, these sanctions are supposed to cut off a key revenue stream used to support Moscow's war machine. More sanctions is good. And Ozzy, yeah, I mentioned the canal earlier. It's the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam pretty much put it out of commission no matter what. So it's not like they can just start pumping water into that canal. Then there's this one from Bloomberg. From the Insider, China cuts sales of drone components to the US and Europe. Now, a lot of the drone components that Ukraine has been using to manufacture their drones are Chinese in origin. And, well, this is interesting. I mean, China's obviously got the most common components for that type of drone work. They're manufacturing in bulk. But is this cutting off their nose to spite their face? Yes, there could be a short-term problem. But longer term, the longer they refuse to provide these drone components, the more likely it is that competitors are going to stand up manufacturing facilities to fill the orders that stand idle. So the Chinese may find that by doing so, they're not going to have demand for it in the future. Just saying. Now, this one I don't get at all. According to various sources I'm seeing, the price for sending soldiers to Ukraine from North Korea was airplanes, Su-27s and MiGs, MiG-29s, which would be an upgrade for North Korea's Air Force, make no mistake. But this surely isn't enough to justify all the assistance that North Korea is providing to Russia. So I saw this, I said, interesting. But I'm not going to, I cannot see this being all that North Korea demanded in order to give Russia all this assistance. Much like the Chinese cut off drone parts to the US and Europe to a certain extent, China's exports to Russia have decreased for the first time in 4 months. It dropped sharply in November when compared to the 24% growth the previous month, according to Reuters. So what is it about China? I keep looking at China and I see them playing a long game here. Yes, when Russia was powerful, having an alliance with them meant that they were keeping Russia at bay to a certain extent. But now Russia's not nearly as powerful. And Russian supplies and resources could be used to produce a lot of goods for China. So it's looking like China might have been pulling back from that relationship, playing more of a fair weather friend role here. So China is taking advantage of Russia bit by bit, according to Anton Herashchenko. Moscow, weakened by sanctions, turned to Beijing for help, but this help comes with strings attached. The relationship between the two countries is a friendship on paper. But in reality, it is a way for China to get access to cheap raw materials and export its surplus machinery and consumer goods back into Russia, turning a very good profit and creating a dependence on its manufacturing capacity and economic power. Russian oil and gas are the most obvious and common examples of this quasi-colonial relationship. But as sanctions tighten and the Kremlin's coffers empty, China is expanding to other resources as well. China has become a hub for Russian gold. Remember the UK and their sanctions against Russian gold. There's relationships there. Just saying. Russia, the second largest gold producer in the world, has resorted to using its sizable gold reserves to avoid sanctions by offering gold as barter for goods they need. China might also be refining Russian gold to launder it past sanctions. Export of Russian diamonds to China via Hong Kong have increased 18 times year on year in 2024. While partly this is done, once again, to avoid sanctions, there are signs that China might be processing and selling them back to Russia. About $12 million worth of diamonds were exported to Russia in August 2024 alone. The largest diamond transaction from China to Russia before this was worth only $200,000. Beijing is exploiting Russia very smartly as Moscow struggles to support its war effort. Interesting commentary from Anton Herashchenko. Now let's briefly talk about Lavrov. He sat down with Tucker Carlson. They had a nice long interview. Calling it an interview was a bit of a misnomer there because according to Robbie Russell, well, Tucker Carlson really only said maybe a half dozen to a dozen things. And Lavrov spent the whole time talking. And this particular exchange piece right here was, I thought, very interesting. Let me go ahead and get the audio ready here.
National humanity.
And just play it for you. It's about a minute and a half.
How many have died so far, do you think, on both sides?
It is not disclosed by Ukrainians. Zelensky was saying that it is much less than 80,000 persons on Ukrainian side. But there is one very reliable figure in Palestine during 1 year after the Israelis started the operation in response to this terrorist attack, which we condemned. And this operation, of course, acquired the proportion of collective punishment, which is against international humanitarian law as well. So during 1 year after the operation started in Palestine, the number of civilians, Palestinian civilians, killed is estimated 45,000. This is almost twice as many as the number of civilians on both sides of Ukrainian conflict who died during 10 years after the coup. 1 year and 10 years. So it is a tragedy in Ukraine. It's disaster in Palestine, but we never ever had as our goal killing people, and Ukrainian regime did.
So to put it simply, well, how many people have died in Ukraine? Asked Tucker. Well, we don't know that, but you know what? Let's look at what the Jews are doing. The Jews, those evil Jews, and he knows who he needs to appeal to in his commentary here. This is typical of Lavrov. He has been lying for the Russian government for so long. I'm not sure he knows which end of the truth is up. On top of that, he also told this whopper saying the Russians are interested in finding out what happened to Navalny since he is a citizen of their country. But the Germans won't help share the information to help them investigate. And then he talks about the Skripal poisoning in the same way that, clearly it's a Western plot to poison Putin's enemies in Russia and thus destroy Russia by poisoning Putin's enemies. I mean, come on. Like I said, if you're going to tell apparently if you're Russian, you got to tell some whoppers. Just saying. Lavrov's good at that. He's been doing it for a long time. So let's go ahead and go into the front lines for a bit. I've got a little bit about Kherson in particular in just a little bit, but we're going to kind of quickly bit through what's going on, because honestly, there's not been, despite the, almost 2 weeks it's been since I streamed last, there's not been that much change. And it's strange to say. There has been some advances by Russia. I mean, there's that much is clear, but not huge advances. And we'll see what I'm talking about in a moment here. Over on the front lines, let's go ahead and mute this here. They find that we're digging a hole to find water. The Russians have to dig their own wells in order to get water on the front lines. And that's some nasty looking stuff there, that mud, but they dug down until they finally got some water that they could drink. And, you know, come on. Why can't the Russians provide water to their troops? Russians attempted to assault Pokrovsk itself and ended up having 15 of their men killed and 1 more taken prisoner. And the Ukrainians destroyed a key bridge that the Russians were using for a logistical route as well. Pokrovsk is one of the areas that's getting it worst right now. The Russians have focused a lot of their military hardware and men into this area. Yeah, yes, Phil. I would comment about that too, but yeah, about the downhill from another position's latrine, which would be hilarious. Yes. Anyway, the situation in Pokrovsk is the roughest, I think, on the entire front lines. Definitely not pretty for Ukraine at this point in time. From the Defense Intelligence of UK, the update on Ukraine from December 7th. Most Russian advances in recent weeks have centered on 3 areas: the Pokrovsk axis, the Kharkova axis, and the Velika Novosilka axis, all in Donetsk Oblast in southeastern Ukraine and closely connected. On the first, Russia has made gradual gains towards Pokrovsk, taking control of the town Saladova and expanding the salient. Russian forces remain approximately 6 to 7 kilometers from Pokrovsk itself. Russian forces are likely fighting within the center of Kharkova. Kharkova forms an important section of the front line, and its seizure would allow Russian forces to consolidate positions in the area and set conditions for further advances westward. The Ukrainian armed forces have reportedly mounted a limited counterattack to the north of Velika Novosilka, retaking the village of Novyi Komar from Russian forces. Despite this, Russian efforts to cut off the supply routes on the northern approach to Velika Novosilka and encircle the town continue. Russian forces are also pushing towards Velika Novosilka from the south, recently capturing the village of Blahodatne. So that's a good summary of basically where all the big, in quotes, advances are happening right now. So let's take a quick look at the maps. And we got 2 different maps here, and today I'm using 2 different maps for a reason. The situation near Kursk really hasn't changed much. There was a little bit of additional Ukrainian presence, a little bit in the southeast corner here. The Russians appear to have pushed in to retake some of that territory. Down, let's see, got to get it right here. Okay, let's compare it to the deep state map. Bloop. Here's the deep state map's report of the same location. Now you note here that there's this portion in red, and is showing that the Russians have potentially entered Sumy. Now, I've gone through this with several other sources, and I think the one that's probably the most likely to be accurate is Greg Terry Experience, also on YouTube, who does a lot more streams than I do, to be brutally honest. And he also has a lot more contacts in this area. And he says this is not true. I am inclined at this point to believe him, because I've not seen any other actual proof of this other than effectively social media. This is literally a TikTok advance from everything I'm seeing. So that's the reason why I've got both these maps up. You can see here the live UA maps showing nothing here. It does show an announcement there saying that there was a denial of a Russian incursion in this area. So that's the scoop. Currently, I believe there is no advance into Sumy, but I am prepared to be wrong on that. But this is the best information I can provide at this point in time on it. The other areas of the front, no real changes over here near Kharkiv. Hasn't been in a while, although I do note that there's been some expansion of Ukraine's control area in this area right here. I think you can see that on the screen. So that's probably older information, and I'm just now getting a good look at it, but just be advised. Do a quick compare here. The two maps really are... they're very different in how they portray this situation in this area. So close. We'll just say that there is no significant changes in the lines of control. Again, I'm going to skip over the whole Pokrovsk area and do that with the deep state map. Let's pop down to the Dnipro River and Kherson region. And I'm going to talk about this more in just a moment, but there's been a lot of things going on here. The Russians have apparently attempted to launch some attacks into this river area and try to take some of the islands in the delta. This apparently met with a lot of first-person view drones and was destroyed. Therefore, the lines have not changed. Now let's go ahead and pop down. I think in this area, there's not been a major change in the last few days. Yep, okay, no change there. Let's go ahead and get down here. Oh, here we go. Pokrovsk. Here's the situation in Pokrovsk, which is basically the only area with a significant amount of change that you can see in just the last day or so. A lot of little expansions of the Russian control areas. Not a real pushback on any areas that we can see. But overall, the Russians are apparently trying to straighten out their line some because it takes a lot of troops to hold all these little jiggly wigglies here. So overall, again, this is the area that's seeing the most advances from Russia and the area we're going to have to watch most closely overall. This is hard fighting and a lot of things going on. Let's go ahead and just pop over to null reports. No changes from 2 days ago, but there was Volodar, where the Russians made slight gains towards Suki-Yali, and Pokrovsk, which we mentioned before, with the Russians moving towards Pokrovsk, mainly south of it, and almost reaching Savchenko. They could control that supply road in short order if things continue as they are. Ozzy, I'm not saying that Greg lied. Like I said, at all. I'm saying that he is the most likely to know the information. With no other confirming sources that I can get to, I cannot confirm it outright myself. But I absolutely, at this point, believe Greg Terry, at this point in time. And then there's War Gonzo's report, which is, okay, this is the one that actually gives me the most reason to believe that nothing is happening near Sumy. Because he reports Zaporizhia, no significant changes. Donetsk, he reports the various changes that happened there near Pokrovsk. No changes near Chasiv Yar. They do claim to have liberated a settlement near Kursk, near the settlement of Plakovo. But they don't mention anything about Sumy. So this is the one that most leads me to believe that there was, between Greg Terry, who I believe has good sources on this, and the lack of reporting from War Gonzo. Put the two together, and my belief is that there's been no incursion into Sumy at this point by the Russians. The Ukraine control map does say that the Russian forces have reached the Sukyali River, with the Ukrainians having withdrawn in good order, and more Russian losses emerging from Kursk. So, by and large, again, we're just kind of seeing the same theme going around. Well, let's talk about Kherson for a moment or two, because this is where things get really tough. Russian forces have been using Kherson as their drone playground. It's where they train their baby drone operators to be big drone operators. Unfortunately, they don't do that by targeting military facilities or military targets. They target civilians. And you can watch here a civilian car, a civilian running away from it. There's a civilian driving the car. It starts to move, and then the car is struck by a Russian drone. They call it good practice for young drone operators to upgrade skills. I call this a war crime, because it is. And the Russians should be ashamed of themselves. And yet they aren't. It should tell you more about the Russian soul than it deserves. Russian forces have become more active on the Dnieper River, trying to take control over the islands and the delta. This Russian boat and personnel didn't make it to Ukrainian positions, which I can quickly play this 10-second video. Direct hit. The Russians are finding that the Dnieper is not as easy to get across as they would hoped. Okay, yeah, Ozzy, yeah, didn't mean to get a little bit frosty on that one. I'm just saying that I do believe Greg Terry on this one. So, yeah, Phil, and that is part of the issue now, isn't it? Russian soldiers increasingly sabotage their own boats and equipment to avoid having to storm the Dnieper River Islands on the southern front, according to a Ukrainian resistance group. This is interesting. It means that the losses of the Russians in Kherson has gotten so acute that even the Russian soldiers themselves don't want to touch it. Fascinating stuff going on. A Russian mill blogger is even requesting airstrikes in the Kherson front line on his Telegram channel, saying that Ukrainian FPV activity is too high for them to do anything effective. And finally, a Ukrainian attack on a Russian dock made a direct hit into the repair area, lighting the whole thing on fire and destroying everything inside. Basically getting their water pipes, plywood, and plastic bottles, everything of their equipment near the Tendra Spit in the Kherson region. The situation in Kherson is heating up again. I think the Russians are hoping that Ukrainian forces are so distracted by other areas that they can pull off a Hail Mary pass here, quickly capture something that they can hang their flag on and call a victory. And that's the front lines. Like I said, there's not been a lot of changes, except for the little tiny changes around Pokrovsk, an area like that, over the last week and a half. And should say more about the situation than anything else. But now let's get into the interesting extras. Let's see, I already talked about that. Yep, good. We're getting on the end here. A Russian Bakanka transport with advanced anti-drone protection. It looks like a chicken coop. If it works, it works. I don't believe it's going to work, though. Oh, I think I got to refresh this one. Hang on. Okay. Now, this is pretty cool. This is a Ukrainian drone that's now been approved for operation with a 50 cal, a Browning 50 cal machine gun mounted on top. Entirely remote controlled, and doggone it if that's not going to be effective in the field. The thing's the size of at least width of a small car, but much smaller as far as height and much smaller of a target. Interesting, and it deploys this into the field without having to risk an operator to fire the stupid thing. So interesting to see. The Ukrainians are definitely messing with the latest in drone warfare. Russian soldiers near Velika Novosilka captured some Ukrainian positions. And they examined them and saw that they were in these prefabricated containers in there. They had these 3-meter deep trenches, lots and lots of food that the Ukrainians had. The Ukrainians were well equipped and well supplied as far as the stuff inside their trenches. But when the Russians finally captured it, they're like, this is nothing like what we have in our trenches. Amazing, isn't it? Even the ones that get lost are still in better condition than the ones the Russians dig. There was a big operation with Sea Baby maritime drones against Russian helicopters, aircraft, and patrol boats that attempted to block the mission. The Sea Baby drones deployed heavy machine guns with automated targeting and auto-lock systems. And the intercepts of the radio communications afterwards indicate there was significant casualties and injuries among the helicopter crews that tried to stop these Sea Baby drones. They also sustained significant damage to the helicopters and now require major repairs. But interesting to see the use of these Sea Baby maritime drones still causing havoc on the Russian side. And we've got 2 items to end off with. I will start with this one here. This dog has been waiting every day near a gas station for his owner, Alexei Savransky, who died in battle in Donetsk 2023. Alexei worked there and often took his dog, Lyoshka, and the dog just sits and waits and hopes to see his owner again. The people there care for him, even as he waits for his owner to return. And we'll end off with this. Shpilka, a gentle and brave combat dog. She was rescued in the Donetsk region by the soldiers of the 116th Brigade of the Territorial Defense Forces. Since then, she's become a loyal friend and helper to the service members. And that's everything for today. Thank you for joining me. I know that there's been a lot of stuff to be said and a lot of stuff that I could never say. The situation in Syria, the situation in Transnistria, the situation in Georgia, they're all interconnected. And each one affects the others. With the fall of Syria and the Russian forces pulling out of there, it could actually be bad news for Ukraine in the short term. They may be able to refocus their forces from there to attacks in Ukraine. But the loss of the revenue streams that come through that area could have dealt a final long-term blow that could result in the destruction of the Russian Empire. We won't know until reality, till time tells all. And that's everything. You have a great rest of your day. Thank you for being here. You guys make these streams special. You have a good one. We'll see you on the next video.